and live. So I thought I wanted to comment on this proposed debt forgiveness scheme put out by Biden. I've talked about education probably as much as I've talked about any other topic on this channel. Every level of the system in the United States is so awful and terrible, whether we're talking about elementary school, whether we're talking about high school, middle school, and college. And what's interesting is it's terrible in different ways at every level. And what's so ironic about what they're doing right now is it's going to make everything worse. And I mean, there's a couple takeaways that I think almost everyone's going to know and go over, and I'm going to cover some of them. And there's some other things that I think are maybe a little bit less obvious. But the first thing is I saw a lot of people commenting in social media saying things like, well, look, these people were kind of, I don't want to say forced, but pressured into it. Predatory lending. A lot is said about so-called private colleges, for-profit colleges like Corinthian and ITT Tech. Whatever criticisms you could level towards them, it would equally apply. In fact, they are much smaller offenders to the private school or the public schools. Public colleges cost a huge amount, and they don't automatically lead to jobs. Some programs do, some programs don't. And while ITT Tech, at least is not giving people completely worthless degrees, or at least ostensibly worthless, all the humanities classes that you're going to take at any nonprofit college, and it's funny to call them nonprofit, they're highly profitable. They rake in millions and have savings in some cases in the many billions. The resources at their disposal are quite considerable, and yet to call them nonprofit, kind of strange credulity. But there's this idea that, well, look, kids in high school and indeed even before high school are heavily pressured. They're very young. They don't know what they're doing. They're led to believe that if they don't go to college, they'll be losers. They'll never make any money. There's kind of two broad things that, on the one hand, your material well-being will be impacted negatively, and also your status will be impacted negatively, right? People who don't go to college have low status by and large. Obviously, there are exceptions. And I think in reality, the fact is that many people who go to college but then don't get remunerative careers, the only status they have is their diploma, and that's honestly not that much status. They can still be poor. They can still have a bad job or no job. They can be unemployed. They can be dependent. Many people with college degrees continue to be dependent. That's one thing about them that I think in general they kind of encourage people to be dependent, right? You're not living on your own. You're not paying your own bills. You're borrowing a ton of money and then staying in a dorm, and the school is providing your meals. They're deciding what classes you have to take, within reason. And you're not on your own. You're not managing your finances. You may not be working. So many people do work in college, and I think for those who do, they get a better experience overall, but many don't. And the point is, though, that you have all these people going. They're flooding in when they're very young, relatively speaking, and they incur huge amounts of debt. Most of them are not going to walk into something that's going to pay a huge amount of money. Some will, some won't. It's one of the tricky things about the whole situation is you can't generalize completely. Not every diploma is the same. Not every school is the same. But then they'll say, look, the school is so expensive, tuition keeps going up, and all that's really fair. Those are all fair things to say, right? But giving a bailout like this doesn't fix any of those problems. Saying that everyone will get $10,000 or $20,000, and I know there's going to be some means testing, so that at least makes some sense, I suppose. But that does not do anything to dissuade the 18-year-old that maybe they shouldn't go. That doesn't do anything to lower the cost. In fact, the main reason that the cost of tuition in schools in general has gone up so much is because government regulations have restricted the supply, and government flows of credit, easy credit, have vastly increased the demand. So there's no incentive for any of these schools to try and become more cost effective. And it's led to them having an educational model that is completely ossified and stuck in the early 20th century. And you really saw this. And, I went to college from the years 2002 until 2008. So a 6-year period. And that really saw the acceleration of costs, of standards of living on campuses started to increase, mushrooming in new facilities, better facilities. It used to be kind of the cliche that the dorm would be very small, there'd be no air conditioning, there would be communal bathrooms, there would be no privacy. The cafeteria food would be bad and generic and plain. The cliche is a cafeteria lady ladling out broth or gruel or, some kind of easily prepared cheap dish, potatoes, things like that. And when I got to college, some of that was still there. The dorms still didn't have air conditioning, but the stalls had replaced the communal showers. But the cafeteria, and I remember finding this odd that when I went to the cafeteria, it wasn't just an assembly line where they were forking out your allotment of calories. There were individual spots with employees there. There was a pita pit, there was a pasta pit, there was a juice bar, and you would go and say, well, I want to have chicken Alfredo with rigatoni or tortellini, and the guy would prepare it and give it to you. And you could come back. As long as you were in the cafeteria, you could eat as much as you wanted. In fact, there were sometimes people who would buy a meal plan where they were entitled one meal a day, and they would just go in there for lunch, stay in the cafeteria doing homework, and then have dinner 4 or 5 hours later and never leave. And that was completely permitted and allowed. But the standard of living was much higher, and you could see the schools building beautiful rec centers, beautiful gyms, beautiful stadiums. The school that I went to didn't have a particularly amazing football team. And yet I just saw the other day, a promo video, and the video itself isn't new, it's from maybe 4 or 5 years ago, but the players' lounge for the football players and some of the other athletes is astounding. Slate waterfalls, a bar that doesn't serve drinks, but that has a person who makes smoothies and shakes on order for free for all the players. Pool tables, gaming systems, obviously a whole spa. They showed pictures of it, just amazing. This is the level of stuff the professional athletes didn't even have in the 90s, right? Again, rec centers, they were always building new rec centers, new pools. I see Jeff saying rock climbing walls, high dives, and also the students typically are not very often. I mean, good, many people go, and so not everyone does the same way, but people will live far, far, far beyond their means. Now, when I went, I stupidly lived in the dorms for 3 years. And the dorms are very overpriced for what you're getting. I think when I did the math on the food, it was something like I was paying $9 a meal. Now, you might have been able to eat that much of it, but at the time, since so much of my income was going towards tuition, and tuition wasn't even the start. There's a whole racket when you get to textbooks. I'll do another tangent on that. That's such a scam, and so completely stupid given the technology that currently exists. But when I moved off campus and I started cooking for myself, I got my meals down to $1.50 a meal, right? Because I was eating ramen, I was eating beans, I was, eating oatmeal, things like that, where I literally was less than $2 a meal. And when I moved off campus, I just, went onto a website that showed apartments, and I found an apartment that was a shared house, so five guys in one house, and my only criteria was I wanted it to be the cheapest place I could find that was within walking distance of school, because if I did that, I would not need to ever buy bus fare. I would not ever have to have a car. I could just walk to and from school. And most of the places that were close to campus were in the $600, $700, $800, $1,200 range. But I found a place, this house, I think my room was 7 feet by 8 feet, shared bathroom, shared kitchen, which turned out to be a huge problem with my roommates, or at least some of them. And it was $250 a month plus utilities. No AC, and there was a blacktop roof outside my one window. So in the summer, it was like a sauna in my room. And I was not the only one who did that. There were other people who did that, but most people, most of my friends, my relatives, they would find a nice place. They would find an apartment complex. So the apartment complexes tended to be much nicer than the dorms. And these were being built while I was there, going out and leveling old areas, old malls, farmland even, and converting it into these basically cities for college students that had rec centers, that had pools, that had gyms. And then your apartment would be 2 or 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, a full kitchen, all new, all furnished. And, you'd be spending $1,500, $1,600, $1,700. This is 20 years ago. And people would do it. And they would just tell you at the school, you can't put a price on education, which is a recurring theme here. What you're getting is so valuable that it doesn't really matter how much it costs. You should just be happy to pay. And so, these people, and I would look at it like I bought into the fact that I needed a degree, but I also knew what interest was. And I wanted to minimize my interest. So, on top of living as cheaply as I could after I moved out of the dorms, I always worked. I always had a full-time job. And after the 3rd year, I started working 2 jobs. And I was working at least 65 hours a week. I was working every single day, plus going to school. And I actually lowered my credits. So at the start, I said I went from 2002 to 2008. The reason it took 6 years is that I reduced my credit load to something where I no longer had to take out loans, and I could just pay as I went. And Michigan State, where I attended, one of the Big Ten schools, you could pay 50% up front, and then you had 90 days after the class to pay the other 50%. And if you didn't pay that, they would just void the class. You wouldn't get any credit. But if you were able to pay on the 89th or the 90th day, then you would get it. And I several times on the 90th day walked in and I would write them a check, and I remember writing them checks for $2,600, for $1,400. And I just remember thinking, how long I had to work at Burger King? At the time, I was probably making $7 an hour, maybe $8. How many hours on drive-through every Friday night, every Saturday night, every Thursday night, every Sunday afternoon, right? Like a huge chunk of my life for months, 6 months, a whole semester. Here's the money because I'm taking German, right? I had to take 2 years of German to get my degree. The last classes I took at Michigan State were German classes. Bitch, Rosetta Stone, which is one of the most overpriced systems you can get, is $400 for the entire language. If you go onto Amazon and you look up German books, you can buy every German dictionary, every German grammar, every how-to books. For most of these books are going to cost less than $5. Let's say you spend 50 bucks, you get 10 books, everything that you're ever going to need to know. And plus, for big languages and even small languages, there's free stuff online, just free, like the German government, the French government, the Icelandic government, the Spanish, they put everything, even back then, 20 years ago, everything that you needed was online for free. And so parallel to when I was going to these classes for German, I learned Icelandic on my own. And I'm not great at Icelandic, but I'm way better at Icelandic than I am at German. But I spent, I don't know, probably 10K-ish on German, and then there's the racket of the textbooks, right? You go in and they just every year, they issue the 10th edition and the 11th edition, and it's the same material. You conjugate the verbs the same way. The math is the same. Whatever subject that you study in undergrad, and even for graduate school for that matter, doesn't change every year. Unless you're doing one of the critical theories. Those change all the time, I suppose. But everything else, it's the same. The grammar is the same. The math's the same. The words are the same. Music is the same. I had a music degree, right? The most worthless degree ever. But then there would just be the secondary market of these books. And where's the profit in that? I mean, there is, but it's not going to be high. So what do? You just issue a new textbook every year, and then you charge $300, $400, right? These books were more expensive than, rare books that I've spent years trying to get. What's his Edward Vieira's Pieces of Eight. I wanted to get that book for years, and I eventually had to drop $200 after years of looking. Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, a super rare book, a single printing, iconoclastic book, amazing research, one of the best books on the Soviet economy ever, that I spent close to a decade trying to collect all 3 volumes. And, at one point on Amazon, I was selling for $1,500 for just the second volume. I was able to get it for $100 each, I think. But I was spending $385, $400 for a history on opera, for a German textbook, for an astronomy textbook. Right, I had to take some astronomy class every single year. And if you tried to skimp out and be like, oh, I'm going to buy last year's book because it's cheaper, I'll get by. No, all the numbers have just changed. The questions are different. It's a complete racket. And you think, well, why is that? And this is where the socialists of the world will unite in their condemnation and be like, see profit, see capitalism. And it's like, well, first of all, I went to a public school. So, why don't we level all these arguments that they put towards ITT and Corinthian? Let's just take everything on face value about those schools. They're small fish compared to the public universities. Small fish. But they're completely screwed. But why is that possible? Right? Why is it? It's so interesting. Why are some areas providers able to hike prices, scam people? Well, it's because they have protectionism. It's because they're protected from competition, right? And you say, well, there's so many schools. Yes, but new schools, getting new accreditation is essentially impossible. And this is by design. There's a couple other parts of our economy that are like this. Medical things like hospitals are like this to an extent. The way it works is that there are different regions of the United States, and they have regional boards or regional associations of schools, and they must approve new accredited universities. Now, there's other things too. Who can be accredited? There's regulations on who can be accredited, and it includes a whole bunch of things that maybe sound nice, but ultimately raise the cost and are of dubious economic value. So a university to have an accreditation must have a library. It must have facilities that students live in. It must have so many professors who have PhDs. Although, when I went to college, very few of my teachers were PhD students. The school had PhD students, but they weren't actually teaching me. So it's just a requirement to hire somebody who's going to be able to charge more. And yes, many people lived in dorms, and I think most schools would probably have dorms because they can make money selling the rooms, but it's not necessary that they have them, right? They could say, look, here's our school. You can go online. You can just find an apartment. We don't really care as long as you live here. But since it's a requirement, you have to build them. You have to staff them. You have to maintain them to some greater or lesser degree. And all that adds costs. But it doesn't end there, because you cannot get accreditation unless the other schools in your region allow you to, right? And that's why the newest accredited university in the United States is called the New School, and it was founded in 1917. And some of my subscribers pointed out maybe a couple years ago the Flexner Report. The Flexner Report was issued, I think, in 1917 or 1916, and the idea was doctors, the American Medical Association, was complaining that doctor salaries weren't high enough, that there were too many doctors, and for this reasons, there was too much competition, and customers, people who needed healthcare, were able to get it for cheap, because all the doctors are competing with each other and they're bidding the price down. And so we need to restrict the number of doctors. And the way they decided to do that, among others, forcing people to be in the medical association, licensure, forcing people to get licensed, those are on the list, but also restrict the number of medical schools. And in that case, specifically black medical schools. There were too many black doctors. God forbid African Americans get medical care cheaply. And so the Flexner report basically set the number of medical schools and then set the number of students. So right now, medical schools turn away thousands of qualified students. And people will say, and whenever protectionism, ever and always, any degree of rent seeking, any degree of regulatory capture will always be defended as this is to protect consumers. This is a quality control issue. Okay, well, we could look at the United States right now and say every year tens of thousands of people are killed by doctor negligence. It just happens. Doctors are tired, they are human, they make mistakes, and they give the wrong dose, they do the wrong surgery, they amputate the wrong lung, and people die. And I think it's something like 30 to 50 to 60,000. It's in the tens of thousands. It's worse than guns, let's say that. Well, that's bad. So how about we increase the length of if the time in medical school right now, whatever it is, if it's 4 years, 8 years, 6 years, let's double that. And then also let's have a policy of having the number of doctors. Let's say in your medical school, you have 1,000 people and they all graduate. Just take the people with the bottom 50% of scores and be like, guess what? You can't graduate. You're not doctors. You'll get a diploma, but you won't get licensed. It's only the best doctors, only the top 50%. The bottom 50%, you're not good enough. I don't think there's any question that would probably reduce the number of doctor injuries, probably because it would just reduce the number of doctors, so there'd be fewer chances, right? There's no question that would raise the average quality of the doctors. But of course, the downside would be the supply of doctors would be greatly diminished. And so the price for a doctor's time, the cost for the consumer, will increase. And, maybe, I don't know if it would double, triple, something like that. And it would probably lead to more deaths because there'd be less medical. But where you draw the line, right? So you say, well, that's totally outrageous. But unless you think that the Flexner report was outrageous and restricting the number of medical schools and the number of medical students was outrageous, then you're just drawing the line in a different place. How good should a doctor be? He should be good enough that people are willing to pay him. The insurers are willing to insure him. He's willing to be certified by some kind of underwriter's laboratory of medical care. And if you walk in and you want medical care and this person can't demonstrate anything, no association, nothing, well, then you take your chances. But if it's not required and he can do a good job and he's got good reputation, then, that's up to you and them. Because this association is just restricting supply. Well, guess what? That happened to schools. And the number of schools is just set. They have no incentive. Let's do this quicker. Yeah. Jared, well, I guess you did try and become a dentist and it just didn't work out. But yes, it was good for the doctors, and restricting the number of schools is good for the schools. They have an oligopoly on, and then the other big part of that is one thing if they were just schools, but because of licensure laws and because of government enforced accreditation, which again is not across the board, we have industries where this doesn't really exist, and those industries are much more competitive, much more cheaper, much better for consumers. But to the extent that you have laws requiring that you get a degree and restricting the supply of degree givers, then those degree givers, these schools, can charge inflated prices. But that's just the supply side. The demand side is that the government will give anybody as many loans as they want to stay in school as long as they want. So there's no reason to cut costs. There's no reason to deny anyone. There's no reason at all to question, will this person be able to pay, right? If you look in the olden days, and I mean like before the 80s or before the 90s, school was much cheaper, and many people could afford to pay with it just on working a job, even just a summer job. But if you needed a loan, you'd be talking about a few $100s, which, yeah, even with inflation, that would be more, but it would be a lot less than it is now. But if you went to a lender and you said, I'm going to school and I need, say I need $1,200 for next semester for everything. And they would say, okay, well, what are you studying? Like, well, I'm in pre-med. Okay. Sounds promising. So you're going to be a doctor? Like, yeah, I want to be a doctor. Like, okay, how are your grades? Like, well, I've got a 2.5 and I'm not so good in biology and I had to retake a couple courses and blah, blah. And they might say, good luck, but if we pay you this, it's not a collateralized loan. It's not like if they give it to you and you fuck it up, they have something they can take back. They don't. So they might say, you're not a safe lender. You're not a safe lendee. So sorry, we're not going to. But there's no reason if once the government started underwriting them and then giving them directly, which is right, when I was going, they were starting to underwrite things. I got loans from, I think, Freddie Mae and is it Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, right after just as they were destroying the housing market, they were also blowing up an even bigger bubble with student loans. And they've just, here's your money. And people sign up. And so I agree that it's predatory. I agree that it's exploiting these people, and they're becoming basically economic serfs. And then as others point out, well, you can't declare bankruptcy. Maybe we should change that. Right now, you can't declare bankruptcy because you owe the government money, and that's the one thing that you can never, ever default on. And they're basically converting this huge class of people into serfs, basically. But I was thinking about this in the shower, as I often do. Because of the Russia-Ukraine war, I've been reading a lot of books on Russian history. And I have a whole Russia history shelf going way back, actually, to when I was in college. Right, so I was in college, and I was learning an awful lot from Amazon. I was learning an awful lot from books that I was buying that were, I remember very often paying $1 or $2 for a book plus shipping, obviously, and realizing this is the way to go. This is how you really get educated. There's some things where maybe having an expert available to tutor you or impart wisdom to you might matter. I'm not saying that's never the case, but for most things, that's not the case, and I wasn't really getting that in college, right? That was not happening too much to me in university. It doesn't happen to most people in university. Also, there might be other ways to get people's expertise besides having them be professor. But anyway, one of the things that I recently read about in Russia, and I've read about in other societies, you have this phenomenon of the nobility, and I think Americans tend to think of nobility as something like you just have it and your kids have it, and that's kind of how it works. And yes, very often nobility is genealogical and passed from father to son, mother to daughter. And we also imagine a noble, someone like a duke or a baron, somebody with a high status, somebody in Russia who would have had 100,000 serfs, right? There were people, very, very wealthy Russians who had measured their serfs in the tens of thousands. Those people existed, but they were a tiny, tiny fraction. And it used to be like in the 19th century, if you didn't have 100 serfs, you weren't even living well. 100 serfs didn't produce enough surplus for you to actually be wealthy. You might get by in just that. It's only when you get to 500 to 1,000 that's like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe I can afford a piano and some French lessons for my kids. But nobility was awarded as a reward for state service by being in the military, by being in the bureaucracy. If you could come and prove, hey, I can read and write, I'm enumerate, or I'm numerate, I'm literate, I can do math. And it's okay. Yeah, we need people who can do that because we have a state bureaucracy. We need people who can do those things. And if you were high enough rank, those ranks entitled nobility. And if you were high enough still, it would be something you could pass to your children. And some layers pay taxes and some didn't. But you have this process where the nobility grows, and most of the nobility aren't really wealthy. This at some point in France, if you look at the times of the wars of religion, right? So France was riven by these massive internal wars in the 16th century between the Huguenots, les Huguenots, and the Catholic central state, which just ravaged the country. I think there were 4 or 5 of these wars. The nobility was something like 2 or 3% of the population. It's huge. And most of them could not afford to be a knight. It's the idea that they're going to have this glorious armor and this powerful destrier horse, and they're going to, right? They're going to be poor. But what they are going to have is status. I'm nobility. Even if I'm dirt poor, even if I have nothing really to show for it, I have no glory, I'm destitute, I'm even indigent, I'm dependent on somebody else, but I have this little bit of status. And the state recognizes that, and the state appreciates that. So when the state is staffing the military or staffing the bureaucracy, they can go and be like, look, you're just as poor as the next guy, but you're ennobled. So you can be in the military, you can be an officer, or you can be in the bureaucracy and actually make a wage. Maybe it won't be very much. And then what it does is it gives these people a buy-in to the system. They're vested with the central state. And I feel like a large number of people who are getting degrees, some of them are going like, look, I've got a plan. I want to be an engineer. I want to be a doctor. I want to be a lawyer, whatever. I need the degree to do that because of the rules. And then I'm going to go make money in the private market. Great, fine. It's a fucked up system that because we have an oligopoly, because it's enforced, you're paying way too much. And there shouldn't be licensure, right? Licensure is just protectionism for established providers. That's all it is. In practice, maybe you could debate and be like, no, they're doing it to protect consumers. They will always say that. There is never be a time when they don't say that. But in practice, it's protecting existing providers and existing providers who have enough money and status to reach a certain threshold. But there's also a lot of people who just want it for status. Doesn't matter if they live in their parents' basement. Doesn't matter if they don't have a job. Doesn't matter. They have status. And these are the people who feel like they're entitled, right? Nobles are entitled, and these grads are entitled. They think they just deserve it. Okay. Now, if your value to society, if your education, your scholastic achievements were actually valuable to society, then you should be able to make a wage on the market. You should be able to, or be an entrepreneur on the market. You should be able to go and be like, this is what I know. This is what I can, whatever the field, whatever it may be. And if you actually have value, people will pay you for it. And if you don't, they won't. And if they don't, it means you don't have any value, at least using it the way that you've been using it. I don't want to tell someone that you have no value, because you can probably find a way. But if you don't bother to do it, then it's not really there. And what's interesting is, they're like, no, it's valuable in the abstract. This idea that we have educated people in the country, and that's just good for the country in some sense. Okay, well, then I will give you status in some abstract sense. I will say, yes, it's great. You went to college, and we have a lot of unemployed college people. Wonderful. But they're not asking, to the extent that they approve and are clamoring for this, which many of them are, they're not asking for an abstract reward for being educated. They're asking for a concrete subsidy, right? They're not saying, I don't just want status. I want $10,000 fucking dollars, right? And I guess as educated as they are, they don't know that the government it does create money out of thin air, but that comes then at the expense of everybody else. It either will tax that money, or it will borrow and then tax even more to pay the interest on the loan, or it will just print the money. And the inflation will hurt everyone, and especially the poor. And what you will have, by definition, is the people who lack diplomas, or the people who have diplomas but have paid them off, like me, will be subsidizing you. And here's the other huge problem with this. It exacerbates every other problem with the college, the education industrial complex. and it adds a huge dose of moral hazard, right? You're having people who, you're telling people you don't actually have to make the money. You can go and get the stats. I mean, if they're getting the bailout, do they have to give up their diplomas? I would almost feel like that would be better if they could say, okay, yeah, I couldn't make it work. I got the diploma. It didn't lead anywhere. So, I'll give it back and I'll get a refund. That would be kind of nice, actually. If you could go back to your school and be like, you know what, fuck your degree. I would love that. I would go back to Michigan State and be like, you can have my diploma back. You can have it back. I'll give it back to you. I don't want it anymore. I don't even use it. I could demonstrate that it's never earned me a penny. So yeah, I'll give it back, and you can give me back however much I spent on it, which I don't even know. Probably over $100,000. I had some scholarships, but it's not just tuition. It's room and board. It's all the books, and it's the opportunity costs. I was a junior when I thought about the opportunity costs, and that's when I was like, I have to get fucking out of here. This is ridiculous. Yeah, I paid off and then after I graduated, and this is why there's so much more backlash on this, because you have people who have gone back and paid it back. And it's fascinating to see. It wasn't me. I don't post on social media myself so much, but I remember a guy, grinder guy I met, he went to college, don't know if he graduated or not, took out student loans, and then he just went to work, and he worked his ass off. I know that he worked his ass off. He would do that thing where you show up at a gas station or a grocery store and he would rate it. He would say if the bathrooms were clean, all that. Sounds easy, right? Well, to make a living doing that, he would drive thousands of miles every week, more than I drive now. And he would be visiting 30 or 40 sometimes. I asked him this on a busy day, 30 or 40 gas stations a day, and then doing all the paperwork, and he's got to list it on and record his mileage, and busted his ass for decades, a decade and a half. And he paid off his loans. And now you're going to come and tell him, you actually also have to bail out the other people. And, it's so funny. Joe Sobran makes this point. The left has inverted it so much that wanting to keep your own money makes you greedy. Wanting to take other people's money through the government makes you altruistic. Give me $10,000. Give me a bailout. You're greedy if you don't want to give me a bailout. Shut the fuck up. And I grant all the things that people go in predatory loans, but what you are the one ultimately who is responsible. There is no way the system works. Any system works. If you say, nah, it's ultimate, it's not your fault. Again, if they made it so you could give your diploma back, you know what, I'm not a grad, take it back, give me the money, give me half the money. Okay. But if they're going to take these ballots, they say that their education makes them valuable to society. No, they're the ones with the diploma. If the government bails you out, you don't give up your diploma, you get the diploma and you get whatever benefit that is. And if it doesn't give you any benefit, you were either very foolish in getting that diploma, which I was very foolish in getting my diploma, but I paid for my mistake, right? I worked my ass off too. And by deferring consumption, I remember I was making good money eventually in a job that I did not need a diploma for, and writing checks for $5,000, $6,000 just to pay off my debt. I think when I graduated, I had about $25,000 that I still owed, right? I paid down a lot when I was still in school. So that's quite manageable compared to what a lot of people are now, I understand. But I was living, I remember living off ramen and oatmeal, and I stole some cheese from one of my, please don't accuse me of violating the NAP, but I stole a pinch of shredded cheese from my coworker because I wanted some fucking protein. But I was living super cheap, and I would write these huge checks until I paid off my loan. Okay? So now I'm going to be punished by that. Yeah, it's hard for me not to find that to be just incredibly pathetic and selfish from the point of view of everyone doing it, if you're advocating that. Right? And there was a case where Elizabeth Warren, who's much worse than what Biden is talking about, got confronted by guys look, I worked extra hours, and I know my daughter's friend, she has student loans too, and her family, they go on vacations, right? They just live large. And that's the other thing. So people will say, look, well, I work really hard And I try really hard, but life is tricky, and I wasn't able to. I'm just a huge victim of circumstance. That can happen. That can really happen. There's this term called the worthy poor, people who are unable to get by on their own and no fault of their own, right? There's a lot of, but most of poverty is choices people have made. But there are certainly some where that's not the case. But this law does not make any kind of distinction. And there's lots of people who have just not been thrifty or have been gaming the system. I had a roommate who turned out to be a pedophile. He was in his 70s, and he had a lot of student loans. And he would just enroll in online classes, take one class, he'd take out a loan for the class. And as long as he was still in school, he could defer. He was never going to get a degree. If he ever did get a degree, he wasn't going to work. He was done working. He was on Social Security, the whole 9 yards. But they had special programs for anybody, even somebody who is clearly past the point where they're going to enter the workforce. He'd been avoiding the workforce for 10 years when I met him. And he is just racking up student loans and taking one class at a time. And then you'd have 6 months after the class, and he'd sign up for another class, and he could just defer as he grows the debt. By the way, I've known other people who weren't pedophiles and old who are doing that too, who, they're done with school. They have the diploma, but they don't want to pay back the loan. So they just go and borrow more. They make the loan bigger to defer payment. If there's a plan, like, in a year you're going to make bank, okay, fine. But if you're just doing that to keep your head above water for another 6 months that is the worst possible. Right? It's like, I'm going to use my credit card to pay off my student loan, and then I'll have blah, blah, blah. But there's many people out there who aren't worthy poor, who aren't worthy debtors. And I'm not even, like, you signed the thing, no one made you join. And if that diploma did not earn you a lot, why did you spend so much on it? But this would apply to everyone else. Are we just supposed to carte blanche? Everyone is this sabster. Oh, you got a family, blah, blah, blah. No, they don't all, right? And it's quite sad. I've told this story many, many times. I'll tell it again here. I once went on a date with a guy, and his Grindr profile, and when we sat down, he mentioned it repeatedly. I'm a master's candidate. I'm going to get a master's degree. He didn't have one yet, but he was going to get one. And that meant so much to him. Now, it didn't mean that much in the sense of he knew if he got this degree, he would just have an awesome job, or his dream job, right? Sometimes you see that too, where someone like, I just really want this job and I have to get the degree. And no, he wanted the status of saying he has a master's degree. Oh, everyone, oh, you have a bachelor's? Oh, like, so we're sitting there at Five Guys having this, low-key date. And he keeps bringing it up. I didn't want to talk about it. I by then paid off my loans, and I was over college. It was a scam as far as I was concerned, but I knew this guy obviously would feel differently. I didn't want to argue. And I was like, well, so how much in debt are you right now? From student loans only, not anything else, not auto loans or credit cards or anything like that. And he was, I think he said it was over six figures. It was like not over six, not as in like seven figures. It was like $130,000 or $140,000. And then I was like, how much longer will you be in school? He said he had a year and a half or 2 years. So I was like, I thought most master programs were 2 years. So he must have just started it, or is it just taking forever? Okay. So how much is that going to add? Another 30, another 40,000. And I'm like, okay. So let's say you get this degree, you get this master's degree, and then you go into that field. What are you likely going to, like, what can you expect? Like, there's, I said, what's the mid-range reasonable expectation? He goes, 60, 70,000. Okay, so you're going to be 160, 200,000 in debt, plus all your other, and the interest on that, and you're going to, if you get the job and it's in the middle, not at the lower end or not at all, 70K. Nah. And I was like, well, where do you work now? Because I work at the Gap as a salesperson. No offense to people who work at the Gap. but that's not going to pay your loans. And, you know, when I brought it up, you could see that he was, he kind of gave me that I'm drowning look, like he's desperate. But in his mind, the status. And so you'd have these people like impoverished, but think I have this thing over other people, and I'm going to remind them as much as I can. And that's worth it to me. And then the state will validate you. The state, you know, I'm sure no matter what happened, and this was probably 7 years ago that this date happened, highly likely that he has a ton of student loans to this day. And I bet he is very entitled. He probably is very happy this is happening and thinks this is just a gift to me. But I have to pay for that. My friend from Ohio who busted his ass has to pay for it. People who never went to college have to pay for this. Right? That's not fucking fair. No one made him do it. He just decided it was good. Now, again, I appreciate the indoctrination that is just pumped into high school people. You gotta go, especially white. This is one of the things where black culture is actually better because it doesn't indoctrinate kids to go to college so much, right? You know, all these people will complain about black culture, and yeah, it makes them really homicidal maniacs sometimes, and they have kids out of wedlock, and it's real bad in a lot of ways, right? It's not a super amazing culture for productivity, but it doesn't make them waste their lives in college, so I'll give them that, right? And these middle-class white kids just become, and that's not just, their black people do it too, but like they go, they get the status, and then they get labeled with this debt to the government that they can never unpay. But then they have this certain status, and so they can go in the bureaucracy. They can become an IRS agent, for instance, right? They need 85,000 people to go and terrorize everybody else to get the money to pay for their fucking bailout. I imagine more than a few of them will feel quite righteous about that. Again, if what you learned meant you could offer something that valuable to society, then you could earn that as a wage. If no one's willing to pay you for what you have to bring, then it's just objectively not that valuable. It's not worth anything, let alone $10,000 bailout or $20,000 bailout. It's not worth any of that. Now, nobody is worthless, but apparently the degree as you're using it is not adding any value. There's no value added. And there's this thing, and it's not just with college, it's this dichotomy that doesn't make sense. There's this tension, this contradiction, where on the one hand, school is billed as this is for your personal development. This is to make you more marketable. This is to teach you skills. This is to teach you things, to give you an ability to navigate the world in a way that will be to your benefit. And that's how they sell it. You know, we need to have public schools because poor people, you know, are helpless, and we need the schools to teach them things like algebra and geometry so they won't be helpless anymore. Yes, because those things will help them a lot. But then when you look at the curriculum, the connection between what is ostensibly taught and your financial success is, shall we say, tenuous at best. And that's assuming that they're teaching it really well, which is an assumption that's not safe to make, but let's just not even go there at this point. We don't have to talk about the teachers' unions and all that, but it doesn't seem like these are apprenticeship programs. They're not, and you could make the argument like, well, there's certain things that in specificity won't make you earn more, but they'll give you a general ability. So this is why they used to teach things like Latin and Greek. You don't ever have to know them, but they'll make you quote unquote smarter in some sense. Okay, I'm not going to say that's completely impossible, but the connection between that and your real world paychecks is quite shaky. And college, similar. Well, you know, you get all these, well, if you go to college, you make more, blah, blah, blah. But on the other hand, there's this other thing, and that's the whole idea of being a good citizen. It's not for you. It's not to help you make more or get a better job. It's to craft a person who will be better for our quite democracy, right? It'll make, and I'm sure most of you know all the history here with being inspired by the Prussian education system and the horseman. If you look back at the early public schools in the United States, their idea of that were quite different than what we would even entertain now, because it was, we're going to make you so that you're Protestants, that you're not Catholic, that you're, and then later that you'll be a quote unquote good citizen, which meant obedient to the government, that you'll be willing to volunteer for war, that you'll support the state, and that you'll be a good factory worker. You know, the Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, they all put a lot of money into curriculums for that reason. But those are not the same things. And those are two different divergent goals. There might be some overlap here and there. They kind of sell it as the one, but it's really the other. And college is very similar. You know, colleges don't build themselves as, if you come here, then we will teach you X, Y, and Z, and then you'll make bank in the market. There's some of that, but very little. Most of it is you're just going to have this general quality education. Okay, they're not promising anything specific, so you can't really hold them accountable. And I'm open to the idea that might be a good thing for some people, but there's got to be a cost-benefit analysis. But the idea is that you can't put a price on a good education. First of all, there isn't even a metric to decide if it is a good education. They're just going to assert that it is, and we're going to have to assume so, right? I would argue that there's very little good education happening at any level. Even at the best schools, I don't think there's very much. Don't some European countries have much stricter admission standards, thereby limiting the number of university students? Yeah, so a lot of European countries, and this is kind of an interesting debate to be had. They do something that's called, I think it's referred to as channeling, where the idea is they're not egalitarian about it. They look at the population of kids starting very young, usually starting in middle school or elementary school, and they look at the kids and they divide them. Is it channeling? I might be saying this wrong. England does this, Germany does this, most of the European states do this. And they go, okay, this group of kids, you're retarded, right? And we're gonna go to a special school for that, which is much cheaper, right? Because then you don't have to say, well, how, like my school, the retarded kids went to our school, even though I was like, what is the point of that? Is it for our benefit to see what retarded kids are like, or is it for their benefit? Is it the idea that we're gonna rub off on them somehow and make them better, right? Like, there's some interesting ideas there, but it does demonstrably raise the cost of public schools immensely. But then they have another group of kids and like, okay, you are going to go and you're going to be apprentices. You're going to learn how to be plumbers, and they're going to teach you things. They're going to teach you how to read and write and be numerate to a point. But the idea is that you're going to go into a trade, right? And then there's another level that will be like, you're the smart kids, and you're going to be the ones who go and will go to college. And so this is what they have. It's usually based on testing. You get tested, the names are different countries, but it'll be roughly in 8th grade, in 7th grade, in 6th grade, you will be tested. And then, no, it's tracking. You get tracked, and you get, so different tracks, and this track is a college track. This is an apprenticeship track. So there's a lot to be said for the efficiency of that, but it is also basically, a little like The Giver, where they're like, this is going to be your life. And I know in England, if you don't go to the right kind of high school, you cannot go to certain colleges or any colleges. They do restrict. You can only apply to so many schools. So you can't apply to Oxford and Cambridge. You can only apply to one. And I think you can only apply to 5 schools total. I know quite a few guys from the UK who went through that process. And there's tiers, and like if you didn't go to a good high school, you are not going to Cambridge. And there's a really good story of this guy in one of the things is like if you just are not that academically inclined when you're in 8th grade, then you aren't going to go to college in the UK. Now maybe if you can travel to the United States, you can do it because U.S. schools don't fucking care as long as you give them the money. But this guy in high school got really into paleontology, and he really wanted to do paleontology, and he could not go to any school. It was against the law. He was not allowed to attend any school that studied paleontology, but he really wanted to. So what did he do? He moved to Wyoming. He went to Thermopolis, which is a beautiful town in central Wyoming with a wonderful hot spring that I had the great pleasure of visiting back in 2019. And Thermopolis, very cool city, a very small town. I think it's about 3,000 people, right at the kind of the basis of the Bighorn Basin. And on top of having a huge hot spring there and a really nice spa, they have a lot of paleontology. They have a lot of dinosaur digs. And he showed up at the hospital. They have a dinosaur museum there that I recommend you all go to. It's one of the best. It's very small, but it's got a lot of stuff. And he just showed up and he goes, I want to dig up dinosaurs. And like, well, you're not really qualified, but if you want to go sweep the floor. So he goes and he starts sweeping the floor, blah, blah, blah. After a while, they start letting him do more and more. Next thing you know, he's doing digs, he's identifying, and he now has the record. He's discovered and published. He's like the world expert on ichthyosaurs. So ichthyosaurs are these aquatic reptilian, people consider them dinosaurs. They're not technically dinosaurs, but they lived during the Mesozoic era. They kind of look like dolphins, but they're reptiles. And he's like now the world leader on ichthyosaurs. And he's done more firsthand stuff than anyone who studied paleontology in the UK. I believe he was eventually just given a degree, an honorary degree from somewhere, right? So, but yeah, they do tracking and they limit where you can go, and it kind of rubs us as like it's not very egalitarian, and it's very like, we're deciding what your future is going to be. Isn't paying for the loans of college graduates that can make more money completely contradictory to the progressive tax system? Yeah, and isn't this? I hope one of the silver lining here is that, when people are told you need to go to college because you'll be able to make more, they remember this and go, if that's true, why do they need a bailout so bad? If it's going to make you more money, why are there so many people who are in crushing debt, right? And I mean, I'm sure you could say, and the schools would argue, well, it's not because the diploma is not worth very much. It's just those students are idiots and they wasted the time, which is possible. Like you could legitimately have a great degree that could offer you a really marketable position, like legitimately, and just fuck it up. That can happen. In which case, why should the taxpayers bail you out for fucking it up? But I think that's going to be what the schools are going to say, that it's not our fault that these people are just. But then it's like, well, why didn't you prepare them? Like, how, if they're such fuck ups and they're so bad at math and so bad at their work ethic that they splurge everything, right? And you can get into the incentive structures. They have a higher time preference than gay dudes, but you can kind of understand. Like, I have a cousin who's a doctor, so she went to medical school and she got scholarships, so her undergrad was free, but then her medical school was not free and it was super expensive. And she graduated, and then, the first couple of years that you're a doctor, you're doing residency and you don't really make very much. And she fell in love and got married to another doctor. They went to school together. They did in school and then they got married. So they're both doctors. And once the residency's over, they do start to make more money, but by then they're married, right? So they have all the costs of a wedding, and then they start having kids, and then they have to buy a house. And there's a bit of I don't know if it's keeping up with the Joneses or not, but they have a fucking nice house. Betsy DeVos is her next door neighbor. If that tells you anything, like, okay, like, it's a fucking nice house. It had to have cost close to $1 million, if not more. And so it's like, even if they are both making good money, they could likely be in more debt now than they ever were in their school. I don't know. I actually don't know their finances, but like, it's completely plausible because in their position, like, they don't even really start to earn until they're 30, right? At which point they could have racked up God knows how much debt. So, and now they have kids, so they have to subsidize them, right? They probably will be before they pay everything off, they'll probably be paying for their kids' college, which by then will cost, $500,000 just to do undergrad by then, because their kids are pretty young. And this kind of is the other kind of meta point here. So I have I went to Michigan State. Most of my cousins went to Michigan State. 2 girl cousins and 2 guy cousins all went to Michigan State. And all of them married people at Michigan State. Every single one of them. They met someone at Michigan State and they married them. The two guys met a girl. They're married. They've got kids. The 2 girls met guys. They're married. They all have kids. They all have, one of my cousins has 4 kids. The other ones all have 2 at this point. But 3 of them used their degree. One became a lawyer. One became a doctor. One got a degree in packaging. It seems like a worthless degree, but he walked right into a job, entry-level job that he didn't even need a degree for. But a few years later, when they were promoting, because he did have a degree in that field, he did get a promotion. And, by 5-6 years out, he's doing middle management, doesn't have a super hard job, but is making decent money and can support a family. Okay, that's kind of like what you're ideally supposed to do. But then my other cousin, and I have other ones who didn't go to Michigan State also, they didn't use their degrees at all. My other cousin just became an entrepreneur, and he's doing very well, but has absolutely no connection with his college degree other than his wife, and they've got 4 kids, so that's really banging. But like in a lot of ways, colleges have become the kind of like these playgrounds for young adults, the 18 to 22 people. They're designed to be appealing to them. They've got all these events. There's lots of parties, right? So you can go and drink to your heart's desire because your parents aren't around. You can go to athletic events. You can work out. There's all these activities, and you can fuck, right? And you can maybe meet somebody. And I would admit that like that maybe is worth something. I think all of my cousins, while they maybe got more or less out of the degree, the experience of meeting somebody and getting married and starting to raise a family, that's not nothing. But I just wonder if there might Mormons do that pretty well just by making the kids all hang out with each other. You could just as easily live by a campus and not go there, go to the games, go to the parties, go to the library, whatnot. Right. So, and also question, how much they're paying for all of that. But, yeah, getting a master's degree is worthless. Yeah. And there's this huge class of people. I mean, if you get a PhD, the odds that will lead to a tenure track position are actually pretty low. So you're spending way more and then taking this giant risk. And there's, at that level, I think in most fields, complete ideological capture. I mean, when I've met the guys from Harvard, they were explicit. If you don't have the right politics, they will torpedo your entire career. Even if you know everything, even if you can answer every question and pass every test with flying colors, and you're great, it does not matter. They will torpedo your career. They will tell everyone, don't hire this person. They're a bad person, blah, 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 blah. It is a complete ideological capture, at least for some subjects. But yeah, you see, most of my quote professors were people trying to get PhDs. And I don't want to say it's slave labor, but they're getting paid like nothing or almost nothing. They're doing all the work in the hope that they might eventually get a position to pay off the hundreds of thousands of dollars of loans they would have incurred during that period. And I remember hearing some of them talk. I remember one was like, he's pushing 40 and he's still in school, and for what? And there's no real incentive to innovate. There's no real incentive to make it cheaper. There's no real incentive to say, okay, we can get you the same education, but for half as much because, online classes or whatever. Or we cut out all the stupid, even the ones who get degrees that seem to help them will openly admit that half the classes have nothing to do with their degree, right? You have to take all these general eds that have nothing to do, and it's just a way for them to milk your money and to go into more debt. And why not? I mean, if there wasn't an oligopoly, there would be an incentive to not do that. So, hey, at this school, we don't make you take English and American thought and language, and unless that's the area that you want to study, which who would want to study fucking English, but whatever. Hey, that would be, people would maybe want to go there. right? And they could charge less. And then it's, hey, because we're cutting the classes down in half, we don't have to charge as much. And because we don't have this and that, or these sports teams, and I've read a couple of books on the sports teams. Sports teams, the students are subsidizing the players. There's this idea that the sports are so popular that it brings in money. This is true for Ohio State and University of Michigan and UT and maybe that's it, right? Like they even in the schools that do make millions of dollars from their teams, they spend millions of dollars for their teams, and it's very, very rare that they are actually cash positive. They're doing them for status. I know my hometown, so I didn't go to college there, but a lot of my friends did. My brother went there. It's called Ferris State. It's a small, 10,000, 12,000 student school in rural Michigan. And they're Division I in hockey and Division II and everything else. So they're not playing the best schools except in hockey. They're really good in hockey. But they decided at some point, maybe 10 years ago, that they wanted to have a really good football team. They wanted to have a really, really good football team. So they went and they shelled out a lot of money to get a really good coach. And then they said, what do you need? And everything that he needed, new facilities, which cost millions and millions of dollars. And the facilities are more just to entice better players. And then full scholarships for the players, full scholarships for the players' friends. The crime rate in the city actually went up detectably because so many of these, not just the players, but their entourages who were also given scholarships, just upped it up, right? And they took anyone. There were people who had done 1 or 2 years of eligibility a decade before and then dropped out of college, but still had another year they could play when they were 30 or 29. And they brought all these people in, and it worked. They won the national championship in football. And it's like, lots of newspaper articles in the Big Rapids Pioneer, and people in Big Rapids are really happy. Okay, great. It didn't increase the educational output of a single student. In fact, it probably was detrimental. And it's also the case, and I happen to know someone who runs the finances there. It didn't bring in any new students. Like if you want the college experience, you don't go to a small school. You go to a big school. And who cares? They're the national champs in Division II. Who fucking cares about Division II? The best Division II team is worse than the worst Division I team. No one cares. They spent all this money and all this time and went through all this effort, but the president is happy, and it's an accolade he can talk about. But that is typically what school sports do for a school. They're just and they've divorced it from any kind of like well-rounding, like, yes, you go and you study and you're learning all this cool stuff, but you also have the benefits of a team sport, which I think the benefits from playing a team sport are very real. And, if we were going to talk about a well-rounded pedagogy, I would have a hard time not including that in at least kind of a general idea. And I know like a lot of the boarding schools, like the good ones, like St. Paul's School in Groton, they require that everyone play a sport. But in terms of their marketability, none of them are going to go to the NFL. None of them are going to get a good job because of this after the fact. Well, maybe some of them might be able to parlay this into a coaching job or something, but very, very few. Not like institutionally. And the school is just out millions and millions of dollars, and their finances reflect that. It doesn't bring in more students, right? And if it did bring them in, that doesn't mean those students are going to be more educated. So it's a complete. There's like this whole status thing around that. They like to have the veneer of victory. They like to bask in the glory, even though most of them are not going to be victorious. And other than a couple of schools, like again U of M, Ohio State, UT, they don't make money off of it. They lose a ton of money. And the argument is quite strong for many of them that they are legitimately exploiting their players whose bodies are destroyed, who don't get an education that's worth a damn, even relative to the other people going to those schools. And it's the tuition of those other students who are paying for that. And then they're saddled with debt for the rest of their lives and now have to become these insufferable, entitled idiots who need to shame anyone who doesn't want to give them a bailout. Like they're more shameless than the fucking homeless person standing there, at the intersection. Because at least those people rarely come up and say, I deserve this. Their homeless poverty is more deserving of charity than any of these college-educated dupes who will all vote Democrat. So, this is going to make everything worse, assuming that it actually happens, which, given how vested the Democrats are in making this happen, eventually it will, I think. And blatant vote buying on top of everything else. But yeah, these people are like the new nobility. Now, they're not the high nobility. These aren't the people. The high nobility, they went to Harvard and they have friends, and they, after they graduated, took a high position somewhere and are doing fine. These are the other people who like to count themselves in that same social category, but who are definitely not. There are many classes below, but they feel like they have this moniker, this modicum of status and accomplishment, and they clutch it really, really hard, and then they just feel really entitled. And it's like you're the ones who have the degree, you went to college, you are the elite. Even some of my lefty friends are against this because they say, look, people who go to college are not poor people. They're middle class, upper middle class. Why would we subsidize them? If we're going to start if we're going to try and use, these are friends who have no compunction about using the state to try and level, reach egalitarian ends. This has nothing to do with that. This will not reach egalitarian ends. This is taking from the poor to give to the upper middle class, who are losers in this case, right? They couldn't make it work. They have the degree. They couldn't make it work. Anyway, so I hope this causes a lot of people to not go. And if you're in high school and you happen to see this, do not go to college unless you have a very good reason. Your parents are going to pay for everything. I wouldn't even do it then because it's 4 years out of your life and the opportunity costs are not as substantial. But if you have to go, if you have a goal that requires that you must have a degree, you want to be a doctor, you want to be an engineer, or you figure that it will be good for your career. But again, think about this very hard. Like, I want to be a programmer, so I'm going to take a computer science degree. If you want to be a programmer, you need to know how to code, and you need to be good at coding. And you can do that for fucking free on Khan Academy, among 1,000 others. And maybe a computer science degree will help you, or maybe it will just waste your time. And instead of learning how to code, you'll be taking half your classes about the experiences of black immigrants to Cuba, which that's a fine topic in and of its own self, but it's not worth you spending $1,400 a credit hour to go to. So anyway, just thought I'd chime in on that. I hope you're all doing very well.